9 Times Percy Saved a Friend by Liana Legaspi. Chapter 4. Rachel, Grover, and Annabeth. Rachel. Rachel there wasn't someone to freely use the word hate. It was a nasty, deep word that shouldn't be used flippantly, and frankly, she tried not to say it altogether. But right now, oh gods, how she hated Capture the Flag. In all honesty, it wasn't too different from any other game. Everyone wanted to win. Everyone generally played a little dirty and by the rules, or flat out broke them, whichever they could get away with. But Rachel thought that the hunters were taking the game way too seriously. Greek defense lines were being crushed, and Romans, despite their superior numbers, were getting overpowered by an eternal maidens club. And basically this game sucked. Rachel still didn't know who, but someone from Camp Jupiter, who apparently was still pretty sore about sinking so low as to team up with the Greci, insisted on the Oracle's participation. After all, Octavian played. Personally, Rachel didn't really think that hiding behind teammates counted as participating. But she didn't decline. That would have been embarrassing for Camp Half-Blood. And really, when did she ever back down from a challenge? Besides, Rachel thought if she helped, it would have been proof that not all mortals were completely useless. Rachel's team consisted of Katie, Travis, Connor, Mitchell, and Gwen, and she wondered if some god above secretly despised her. Their part in Annabeth and Raina's scheme was simple, discreet, more scouting than any real fighting, most likely to keep the Oracle safe. But Rachel was certain that every hunter within a mile could hear the racket they were making. "What are you talking about?" Katie demanded, barely refraining from yelling, and cheeks colored a deep red. "My mom does not have an obsession with cereal. Shut up!" Rachel couldn't agree with that last statement more. Travis and Connor had been teasing Katie about her mom's little quirks for about 10 minutes, and she was just waiting for the brothers to suddenly turn into wheat or corn any second now if they didn't stop. Travis's lips curled into a sly smile. "Oh, really?" he drawled. "Then how come at the winter solstice Katie reeled back to glare at him and hissed, 'We don't speak of it.'" Mitchell sighed dramatically. "You two are worse than Percy and Annabeth were." Katie and Travis blanched and looked away from each other, and Connor laughed. "I told you she liked you!" And that was exactly when it all fell through to the underworld. In the short span of only 10 seconds, Katie screamed bloody murder. Travis kicked his brother sharply, eliciting a pained yelp. Gwen, whose poor eye had been twitching throughout the whole track, finally broke, yelling for them to shut up and act like grown-ups. And 12 hunters burst out of the dark of the woods, arrows trained on the campers and Oracle. Gwen, frustration instantly whipped away in the way only true Roman could, gave Rachel a piercing, meaningful look and said coolly and clearly, "Run!" So that was how Rachel went up in the woods, separated from her teammates in clunky armor, unarmed. Well, not completely unarmed, of course. They gave Rachel a weapon and taught her how to use it. Sort of. For her first attempt, Annabeth had given her a knife and showed Rachel how to handle it correctly and demonstrated the most basic strikes and blocks, and Rachel honestly thought she had it. But when Annabeth was able to disarm her 2 times blindfolded, well, they both thought that maybe the dagger wasn't the right weapon for her. The daughter of Athena suggested archery. It was the most logical choice. It'd keep Rachel out of the way, and besides, she was the Oracle. Apollo's Oracle. She had to have some serious skill with a bow and arrow, right? Evidently not, because Frank, of all people, lost his patience with her, and according to Will Salas, only Percy's aim was as bad as hers. Percy himself tried to teach Rachel how to use a sword, but every blade felt so unbalanced and heavy in her hands, and just no. Swords didn't really sit well with her anyways, ever since a certain son of Poseidon tried to decapitate her. Finally, completely fed up and out of ideas, they left her to the mercy of Clarice. The daughter of Ares had tossed her a spear and given her lessons, but it didn't matter if Rachel was taught by the best. She was no demigod. Her steps were uncertain and unbalanced. Her swings were slow and sloppy, and where Clarice was all strength and deadly precision, Rachel was awkward and tripping over her own spear. It got so bad, even Thalia, who was competitive as a pageant girl when it came to, well, anything really, ignored the important little fact that Rachel was on the opposing team and gave her a couple pointers, even went so far as to teach the Oracle a few of her own tricks. The hunters gave up about 2 hours later, but it was the thought that counted. It was a good experience for Rachel. She got to experience a life of a half-blood and get some hardcore exercising in. And when she found her way out of that God's forsaken forest, she was going to kill that little weasel who had pressured her into the game. Rachel hefted her spear and crawled her way through the foliage, muttering some of the Greek curse words Annabeth taught her. She didn't like to be labeled as a damsel in distress. She pegged Kronos in the eye with her hairbrush, for crying out loud. But frankly, Rachel was lost in a forest stacked with monsters, and a small inkling of dread was growing in her stomach. These woods were thick, and it didn't even look like anyone had ever touched this area. At least no human. Rachel stopped in her tracks and tensed. Something definitely wasn't right. Every instinct screamed for her to run back to camp, wherever that was. Now! The air seemed to get colder around her, and she could have sworn something just rustled in the bushes to her left. Rachel backed away, gripping her spear with both hands and positioning her feet apart like Clarice taught her. Even if she knew which way to go, her armor would have dragged her down. Her only option was to stand and fight. The leaves of an old, twisted birch tree trembled, and Rachel bared her spear in what she hoped was a threatening manner. Her mind raced with instructions and tips, but her stomach felt like lead. Training wasn't the same as experience. Rachel knew that. It didn't matter how much information was drilled into her head. She had never killed a monster before, and even though she hated to admit it or even think it, she was scared. The tree's leaves finally stilled, and a dryad, eyes closed and clothes crinkled delicately, melted out of the bark with a soft, tired sigh. The nymph's skin was as pale as Nico's, her white hair was speckled with brown, and she looked like a typical birch spirit. Rachel's shoulders loosened, and she lowered her spear. Gods, she thought, smiling wryly to herself. When did I get so paranoid? Hey, she started. Sorry for waking you up, but could you just point me? Rachel Elizabeth, the dryad murmured, eyes finally cracking open to reveal two piercing brown eyes. She released a breathy, humorous laugh. Rachel tensed and slowly backed away, raising her weapon a little. Her eyes darted around the area, looking for a way to escape if worse came to worse. The dryad watched the oracle coldly. You will pay for what your father did, for what he has done to our kind. She closed her eyes and murmured, So many. She breathed in. Every dryad, every nymph, every creature destroyed for William Dare's own gain. Her eyes opened again, and she bared her teeth. That will be on your head. Rachel's eyes widened, and she rolled back in time, looking up to see the dryad claw at the empty air where she just stood. She could just see the headlines now. Rachel Dare, heir to Dare Enterprises, attempted assassination by birch tree. Awesome! The dryad sighed tiredly, like that one lunge completely drained her, and flicked her wrist effortlessly. At first, nothing happened. Nothing jumped out of the trees to kill her or anything, but then the grass beneath Rachel started to wiggle like worms. It thickened and grew, wrapping around her wrists and ankles like ropes. Roots sprung out of the ground and reached toward her like claws, surrounding her like a coffin and tightening. Two of them slithered around her right ankle, one below and the other above, before they thickened, pressing agonizingly down on the bone. A pained, strangled scream tore its way through Rachel's throat just a second after she heard something snap. She was being crushed, not just her ankle, but her entire body. Every breath was a quick, desperate gasp for air, and her vision was starting to go black. Rachel, cheek pressed to the ground, staring up at the dryad through glassy eyes, a million thoughts were racing through her head. If she died now, what would happen to the spirit of Delphi? Where in freaking Hades was her spear? When would people realize she was gone? On a scale of 1 to 10, how painful was it to be crushed to death? And most importantly, were Camp Half-Blood and Camp Jupiter going to win and capture the flag? An angry shout cut through the numbing pain, and the dryad reeled back, sleepy eyes now wide with fear. A familiar figure wielding a bronze sword sliced through the tree nymph as though the blade was simply an extension of his arm, and the dryad dissolved into a shower of gold dust. Her birch tree's leaves instantly withered and turned brown, trickling down to the earth. Percy, eyes wide, knelt beside Rachel and alternated between hacking and ripping away the roots. It was a long, arduous task, but he freed her from her personal wooden deathbed. Rachel recovered her breath and grip on coherence. She glared at the 5-foot-long spear lying uselessly to the side. Lot of good that did. Pain erupted from her ankle where Percy was pulling, and Rachel took a sharp intake of breath, squeezing her eyes shut. Stage! That was impressively excruciating. Percy instantly pulled his hands away like they were on fire. Broken, Rachel gritted out. Talk on that, and Percy, I swear I will skin you alive, hero of Olympus or not. The son of Poseidon nodded curtly. Nodded. And he, much more carefully this time, picked away at the dryad's work. Rachel wet her lips. How did you find me? When Clarice and I broke everyone out of jail, Gwen told me what happened to your group, he said distractedly, solely focused on his task. I told Jason to hold down the fort while I looked for you. He gently pulled away the last of the wood and slung Rachel's arm over his shoulders, helping her up. Percy eyed the spear. You know, the whole point of having a weapon is to not lose it. Rachel huffed, blowing a red curl out of her face. That's easy for you to say, she stated, rolling her eyes playfully. You have a pen with a sword that magically returns to your pocket whenever you lose it. She tilted her head to the side. So like every 10 minutes or when the stoles pickpocket it. Percy mildly glared at her, and Rachel triumphantly smirked at him before another wave of pain spiked through her ankle. She bit her lip hard and mumbled a scream. Good gods, how did Annabeth go through Tartarus like this? Oh, gods, I'm sorry, Percy said, as if he kicked it himself. Rachel waved him off. I'll live, it's just an ankle. Granted, an exceedingly pained ankle, but still. Percy stared at her injury and paled considerably, looking like he was going to pass out any second. His sea-green eyes were wide and unfocused, and beneath Rachel's arm she could feel his shoulders tensing like a spring. Percy? She asked. Slowly, eerily, his eyes cleared, and he carefully bent down to pick her up beneath her knees, lifting her up bridal style, although Rachel thought Annabeth wouldn't be so fond of that term whatsoever. Nevertheless, Percy carried her all the way through the woods, keeping up with her banter, and making her laugh by saying the stupidest things. As Rachel watched his face, she was struck again by just how handsome the son of Poseidon was. It wasn't a new feeling. Heck, it was the most common thought running through her head when she was 15, but still, it managed to take her breath away every time. Dark hair, sculpted face, ever-changing eyes. It wasn't hard to be attracted to that. But now, really thinking about it, it was never a romantic pull. Percy had a trustworthy, friendly charm that most people didn't possess. It was as rich as gold, and one would have to be crazy to not gravitate towards that. But no, Percy was never actually more than a friend. A priceless, one-of-a-kind friend. Something, like a knot Rachel didn't even know she had, slowly untangled itself at the realization, leaving her calm despite the piercing, utterly horrible throbbing all over her body, and she relaxed into her friend's arms, smiling a little to herself. Rachel Jackson didn't have the same ring as Annabeth Jackson anyway. Percy's eyes suddenly brightened, and he gave her an excited, devious smile that reminded Rachel of an 8-year-old. Hey, he said casually, how much do you really want to win this game? Percy's insanely idiotic and half-baked plan required peanut butter, Mrs. O'Leary, your iPod, and a gallon of Dr. Pepper. But aim for once the hunters lost. And Rachel, using her spear as a crutch, hobbled across the border holding the flag, while Percy held off the hunters and cheered right behind her. Rachel smiled to herself. She could always count on Percy for everything. Grover knew that Yancey Academy would be his own personal punishment the moment the scary girl with red hair and freckles sized him up from the opposite end of the hall. She was short and looked completely unnatural in her school uniform, but Grover still shuffled his styrofoam feet in apprehension. Bullies came in many shapes and sizes, but Grover knew one when he saw one, and that red-headed nightmare was in fact a bully. Out of habit, he avoided eye contact and quickly ducked behind a corner, sniffing furiously for his half-blood, hardly trying to be subtle. Every sense, every instinct had urged Grover to this boarding school. He felt a familiar tingle in his nose and ears when he drew near it, but so far all he'd smelled was the stench of polluting humans and cheap perfume mixed with the musky aroma of Yancey. Charming, really. Just as Grover was straightening his hat, someone said gleefully, Wow, a newbie! The satyr instantly froze, and his nose twitched. Shoot! Grover awkwardly trotted around to come face to face with the redhead. He unintentionally flinched back a little. Hades, she was even worse up close. Her skin was pale and dotted with orange freckles. Her hair was bright red and puffy, and her eyes were yellow and crooked. And she reeked of humanity. Grover once again didn't meet her eyes and stuttered, Hi, I'm Grover Underwood. He shifted uncomfortably, searching for words. I'm from Long Island, and The girl rolled her eyes irritably, and she reminded Grover of someone. Oh, whatever, she said. Don't care, but... She traded devious looks with her two friends. We've got an initiation for new kids around here. The redhead gripped the sleeve of Grover's uniform tightly and shoved him into the surprisingly empty boys' restroom. Oh, gods, he thought, realization hitting him. Yancy has their very own Clarice LaRue. She kicked open one of the stalls and pushed Grover onto his knees, stomach twisting and eyes wide as he stared into the water. Ah, so it was that kind of initiation. Grover's heart beat quickly and his breathing spiked. The redhead laughed loudly. Look at him, she gloated. He's not even putting up a fight. Yeah, that was true. Grover couldn't even manage one pitiful cry for help before she shoved his head into the toilet. Water rushed up his nose and in his mouth, and he felt like he was just a kid again. When Grover was younger, he pretty much accepted the fact that he had absolutely no special talents or qualities. He was a scrawny little thing with trembling goat legs and ridiculous little devil's horns. And Grover looked so strange and scared, even for a satyr, that the little woodland creatures picked on him. All of the Dryads and Naiads found that hazing him was an amusing way to pass time. The Dryads would giggle and throw berries, twigs, or pine cones at him, and some would snag burrs on his fur. The water nymphs were the worst. But being the target of Dryads, Grover could handle. The worst a tree nymph could do was throw a really big pine cone at him. It was their watery counterparts that Grover was scared of. The Naiads knew how hard it was to swim with hooves, and they thought it was positively hilarious to watch him struggle for breath and kick helplessly. As soon as Grover had completely exhausted himself, the less malevolent Naiads would drag him back onto dry land. He could never stop himself from crying, though, and that only encouraged them. When Chiron found out about Grover's little swimming lessons, he was furious with the Naiads. Grover didn't know what he said to them because he was a little busy with trying to breathe, but whatever Chiron told them, it was scary. They never bothered Grover again, but he could never get over his fear of water. Grover's hooves kicked uselessly in the water, and he frantically moved his arms in spastic motions, trying to keep his head above the lake and, as always, failing miserably. He wasn't sure if his eyes were welling up with tears or if it was just the water, but his vision blurred, and below him he could hear the Naiads giggling to themselves. A hand ghosted on his leg, tauntingly jerking his mouth and nose underwater, and innocently giggling even more when he gurgled a yelp. Grover shut his eyes. Gods, he hated the water. Never liked it, and his future opinions of it weren't looking too hot either. Naiads. He had an excellent word to describe them, of course, but it was a dirty one that made his nanny goat wash his mouth out with soap once. Grover's lungs were screaming for air now, but when he struggled against the redhead's grip, she only pushed down harder, jamming his head that much further into the water. Dark spots pinpricked his vision, and he could hear the girls laughing. They obviously weren't going to let up anytime soon, and panicking Grover bleated, expelling what little air he had left. If Grover wasn't so terrified, he would have rolled his eyes. Of course he'd be killed before he even started looking for Pan, let alone get his license. He was going to die on his second assignment, and this time he hadn't even found the half-blood. It all happened quickly. One moment, blood was roaring in his ears and his eyes were beginning to roll back into his head. And then he caught a whiff of something salty that mingled with something vile. But he was breathing. The water was pushed away to the sides in a way only a Naiad could control it, and Grover had his own little toilet air bubble. Hey, lay off! Someone, a young boy, snapped, and Grover felt the redhead's hands get pushed away. The satyr pulled his sopping wet face out of the toilet to stare at his savior. He was on the shorter side, somewhere around Annabeth's age, maybe a little younger. His hair was dark and messy, like he just rolled out of bed, and his uniform was wrinkled, but his ocean-colored eyes made him look old and intimidating. Grover was sure that if the boy was in a happy mood, his eyes would be bright and friendly, but right now he could swear there were mini hurricanes brewing in them. The boy glared at the ringleader. Come on, Nancy, what's with you? Nancy scoffed, but Grover thought he detected a hint of nervousness. Get lost, Jackson! This has nothing to do with you! Jackson's jaw set, and his eyes darkened even more, stared straight into Nancy's green eyes, unrelenting. Grover's gaze dropped back down to the water briefly. It was back to normal again. No bubble, just a semi-clean toilet bowl, and he wondered if it was just a figment of his imagination. Grover's eyes lifted back up to Jackson, and a small inkling of dread filled his stomach. Or maybe not, he thought. After what felt like eternity, Nancy flipped her frizzy hair and sneered. Whatever, Jackson! She nodded to her friends, already walking away. Come on, girls. When the door swung shut behind Nancy and her cronies, Jackson's eyes finally softened. He looked at Grover, lending him a hand. Sorry about that, he said. Nancy's been coming here for a while. He rolled his eyes, like that's some huge accomplishment. She likes to pick on the new kids. Yeah, Grover said, subtly checking to see if his hat was still covering his horns. I sort of figured. Not really, but still. The other boy held out his hand. My name's Percy. Jackson. He added at Grover's curious glance. What's yours? The satyr imperceptibly wriggled his hoof back into his converse. Grover Underwood. He thought for a second, picking his words carefully. Would it be okay if I tagged along with you? I don't really, Grover shifted awkwardly. Have any friends? Percy grinned, eyes flashing amusedly. Hey, neither do I. He readjusted the straps of his backpack and turned around towards the exit. And Grover faltered when he caught a trace of the boy's scent. That smell. Percy Jackson was his half-blood, but he smelled like... Percy glanced back questioningly. You coming? Grover shook himself out of his daze and trotted up to his new half-blood, mind racing. There was only one kind of demigod that could control water like that, and only one Olympian who smelled like the sea. The satyr eyed Percy out of the corner of his eye. He needed to protect him. No question about that. He couldn't make the same mistake as last time. Percy Jackson had to survive to his 16th birthday, and it was Grover's job to see it through. Not to mention, he added to himself, it was only right to repay the favor. Oh, Grover. He had no idea just how many times his newest half-blood would save his hide. Annabeth. Sleep, Annabeth had come to realize bitterly, was the best prison of all. Locks, cages, labyrinths, magnetically sealed doors had absolutely nothing on the nightmares that haunted her at her weakest. Monsters Annabeth could fight. Traps she could outmaneuver. People she could outsmart. But dreams? Well, all she could do was pray that it was only that. A dream. When Annabeth was awake, it was easy to stay composed and push back the memories. In the sun, surrounded by friends and family, she was so fearless and flawless and normal that if the campers didn't know any better, they'd say that Annabeth had never even fallen into Tartarus. But once Apollo's sun chariot set, curfew was called, and everyone crawled into their beds, Annabeth was forced to endure nightmares that she couldn't escape or fight. Dark everywhere she turned, creatures out for blood and revenge hiding behind every corner, in every crevice. Those were Annabeth's mildest dreams. That was mercy. Memories were what she was afraid of. Behind you! She yelled. The imposter reached out towards her boyfriend, hands curled into claws, mouth open, and sharp fangs gleaming wickedly. And for a split second, Annabeth wasn't sure if he'd make it this time. But with quick reflexes and expert precision, Percy swung up his sword, slicing her down the middle easily. The imposter howled and vaporized into a dark, misty substance, leaving the nothing behind. Annabeth still wasn't 100% sure what happened to the monsters. Normally, they would have disintegrated into gold dust, their essence returning to Tartarus in order to be reformed. But, well, considering where they were, Annabeth didn't think that principle still applied. Percy nodded at his girlfriend. Thanks, he panted, draping her arm across his shoulder in order to keep her off her ankle. Hermes' bubble wrap was utterly useless now, and she knew it might have been asking a bit too much. But couldn't he have given her something a bit more sturdy? After all, they were saving the world. Again. Annabeth swallowed a little and nodded. Don't mention it. Percy looked up towards two tall, imposing doors, each side chained to the ground and wide open. The doors of death, he said, his voice a little full of wonder, and he gently squeezed his girlfriend's hand. We've made it. Annabeth rolled her eyes, but secretly she was just as amazed as her boyfriend. You don't need to sound so surprised, you know, she quipped. Percy barked out a small choked laugh. Well, after everything that's happened. Annabeth wrinkled her brows and gripped her boyfriend's hand tighter. I know, seaweed brain. She wet her lips and studied the doors, entranced. But we're here now. We're almost out. As soon as we get back to Camp Half-Blood, everything will be fine. Percy stared into her eyes, black hair wild and paler than ever, but Annabeth's heart still fluttered in her chest. You really believe that? He asked. She opened her mouth to respond, but as she met his sea-green orbs, Her words died on her tongue. Instead, she sighed, hanging her head. "No," Annabeth said brokenly. "Not really." An empty laugh echoed in the pit. "But it was worth a shot, wasn't it?" Percy looked down at his worn shoes and adjusted his sword in his hand. "We've made it," he repeated, and Annabeth wasn't sure if he was saying to reassure himself or her. The Percy supported Annabeth carefully, and together they hobbled to the doors slowly, muscles screeching in pain. Percy grinned down at her. "You know," he mused. His voice was light like it always was when the seaweed brain was about to make a joke. Percy's sea-green eyes twinkled mischievously, and a small smile cracked through Annabeth's bleak face. She didn't even see the monster's golden fur glinting in the dim light, crouched and ready to strike. "I think, Leo..." Percy didn't even get to finish his sentence. He dropped to the ground, agonized cry ripping through his throat as the Nemean lion roared, and Annabeth screamed. Sleep was where Annabeth was helpless, where she was utterly trapped in an endless replay of hellish memories, and where she could no longer distinguish a nightmare from reality. Annabeth Chase fell back into Tartarus night after night, like a sick, twisted routine. Blood red and dark, drowned out sea green, and a pair of cold, molten gold eyes were all she could see. She was falling down, 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 like Alice in Wonderland, and she wanted nothing more than to wake, to stop falling. Kronos, in the form of Luke, waited for her at the bottom, and like every night, Annabeth would squeeze her eyes shut, bracing herself for the pain she was about to endure. "Oh, Annabeth," Kronos said, sounding exactly like Luke. "You see, I told you that Percy didn't love you. Not like I did." Annabeth's hands shook with barely contained fury. Or fear. Could have been fear. "Love?" she said, a mock lilt staining her voice before turning harsh. "You left me. You abandoned me just like everyone else did. Only Percy stayed." Luke's face turned hard. "Really?" he growled, gesturing to the empty air beside her. "And where is he now?" Annabeth bit the inside of her cheek. Just a dream, she told herself. It didn't go like this in real life. Percy never left. Percy stayed just like he always did. Luke knelt beside her, and she sat rigidly when he stroked her hair. "He never loved you," Luke said. "If he did, he would have fallen down right alongside you. But he didn't. Percy let you go, all right? He let go of you." She flinched. "Leave me alone." "And left you in Tartarus all by yourself," Luke continued, grinning. "With me." A lump hardened in her throat. "That's not true." Luke snorted and gave her a pitying look. "Annabeth, you're smart. Don't tell me you actually thought that little mirage was real." At her hard glare, he sighed and crouched down like he was explaining a complicated math equation to a 2-year-old. "You never reached the doors," he stated, "reuniting with the Seven, defeating Gaia. That was all just..." He raised his finger and twirled it. "In your head. My own little sandbox now." "Liar!" Annabeth spat. Luke gave her a look. "You think that you, of all people, would win a happily ever after, just because you saved the world a couple times? You'd have better luck winning the lottery, wise girl." Annabeth flinched again. Luke sneered. "Well," he said, extending both arms, "then welcome to your happy ending. Because this is it. Welcome to Tartarus." Luke grinned. "Now, back to your little fantasy." Luke snapped his fingers, the sound bouncing off the walls, and Annabeth's eyes shot open to meet green. Percy sat on her bed, propping her up and holding her firmly, shirt messily thrown on so she wouldn't have to see his scars. Just looking at him made her heart sink. "Not real," Annabeth croaked, shaking her head and miserably sinking back down. "You're not a seaweed brain." Percy's eyes turned misty at her accusation, but an understanding look overcame his face. He laced his fingers with hers and pressed his forehead to hers, even though she tried to shrink away from the contact. He wasn't real, just Kronos' way of torturing her. "Real," Percy murmured. "I swear on the sticks, I am." Annabeth's wide gray eyes didn't show a hint of being convinced, but Percy didn't give up. He took her hand, 3 times since she kept snatching it away, and guided it towards his chest, where she could feel the steady, constant thump of his heart. "Together," Percy said. "Just like I promised. Right, wise girl? Always together." Annabeth, still wary, managed to let herself loosen in his grip. She didn't dare tear her gaze off of him, though. Percy noticed this, forced to smile, and held her hand tight, just like how he did before the fall. "Together," he said, completely sure of it. "I'll never let go, and I don't see that happening any time soon." He nudged her a little, a hesitant grin playing at his lips. "You're stuck with me now, wise girl. No take-backs." She closed her eyes as a shaky smile tugged at her lips and exhaled. "As long as we're together." And yeah, as long as they were together, Annabeth Chase was totally okay with falling down, 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 again and again every night. Percy was always there to catch her anyways.